welcome Rikke and Felicity and myself. We are absolutely thrilled to be hosting a recording of this chat, hopefully not really interview. Yeah, so would you like to just introduce yourself?
Yeah, and thank you so much for inviting me. So my name is Rikke Nørgaard, and I'm an associate professor in educational design and technology at the School of Education at Aarhus University in Denmark, where I'm also in the steering group for higher education futures, and I'm also in the board of the international society called Philosophy and Theory of Higher Education Society. And I think it's especially in those two kind of environments where I've been able to take forward my, I wouldn't even say work perhaps, but thinking about phenomenology in relation to higher education institutions and higher education. Should I say more?
Well, just that I was looking that you'd recently done a keynote about sort of networked or hybrid universities, which is a high aspiration. It seemed to reflect a little bit to me of some of Peter Goodyear's discussion of the types of universities that there are, was knocking about like 20 years ago. How can we get this moved on is my question, but that's perhaps for another time. So it's a really important thing to be surfacing, I'm absolutely sure. But yeah, I also read that you had some stuff about tacit. I was reading a paper of yours about tacit work, and that seemed to reference phenomenology. Would you like to say anything about that?
Yeah, so what is interesting, because I knew we were going to have this chat, so I was trying to think, do I even do phenomenology anymore, except like carrying it within me as a certain kind of approach to the world. So where I actually started really digging into phenomenology was during my PhD, which is actually in game studies, so somewhat removed from education, I would say. But in that PhD, which was called gameplay corporality, so the corporal being of being a game player, and how game players work with and talk with the world through their bodies, and how game design kind of make you dance in a certain way or act and feel in a certain way depending on what kind of design you are playing with. So it was like everything from like a Rock Band to World of Warcraft and iPhone games and stuff like that, following and looking at the hands of all sorts of different game players for 3 years. So I have like 3,000 pictures of hands dancing on keyboards and screens. And so I originally come out of Nordic language and literature, which is kind of poetry and literature and language philosophy, and has nothing to do with bodies and has nothing to do with like even thinking about people. So it was quite of a really new field to me, coming into discovering the body in games. And so I was trying to kind of dig into how to talk about, grasp creative vocabulary for making the body and the phenomenology of experience and interaction come alive through writing. And so I stumbled upon Nina Bonnerup-Dohn's work, where she was working with Merleau-Ponty and Gibson and trying to combine these two. I think it was in her either thesis or dissertation, and I was just kind of starstruck about how you could actually talk about the world. And so I was trying to dig further into that. So of course, reading Merleau-Ponty and reading Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology of perception about the role of the body in the world, and reading Gibson's work on affordances and how we kind of see the world, and then trying to build a whole body from that, or a whole holistic experience. So during my PhD, I also stumbled on Maxine Sheet Johnstone's work called The Primacy of Movement. And I think that was kind of the core work that really changed everything for me during my PhD, and perhaps also moving forward, where she really tried to, she's originally a dancer, so she was talking about how perhaps bodily movement came before bodily schemas and what Merleau-Ponty talks about, how we are born into the world moving and experiencing the world moving. And that really made sense for that kind of interaction I was trying to capture with the hands, rather than it being about functional hand-eye movement. It became like a dance. And so moving from that, I stumbled on David Sudnow's work, and he's a jazz pianist, and he wrote a book called Ways of the Hand, and that was like a poetic phenomenological description of how he learned to play the piano, and how he had to think otherwise about his hands and his body, and how to engage and learn to play the piano. And that really moved me into also trying to write poetically about experiencing the world, learning from the world, and how design impacts us in certain ways. And I think the last really important person that I stumbled upon, that was kind of the last major brick in my work, was Richard Sennett's The Craftsman, where he talks about crafting and how crafting is a certain way of being in the world, and a certain way of talking in the world. And so that kind of phenomenological landscape was what kind of constituted my PhD. And then by chance, luck perhaps, I kind of got got a position within education. And so I just took all that work with me when I started to work with kind of educational design, and design in education, and pedagogical design, educational development, and really trying to bring that poetry and philosophy and phenomenology forwards as a certain way of doing educational development. And I was just kind of, because I knew I had to talk to you, looking at my publication, and suddenly realized, so my PhD is from 2013, but the first time I actually got a chance to actually really use the framework was in 2019. So there's a quite gap where it was only with me in being, but not like something I actually did in writing. But in 2019, I had a chance to write a chapter on university for the body. So often when we do educational development, when we think about higher education, when we think about institutional design and so forth, we forget the bodily being of both academics, staff, students, and so forth. They're kind of just, I don't know, brains on a stick in an auditorium listening to a lecturer, also like a brain on a stick standing there and, transmitting knowledge or something like that. And so I think that's where it kind of came back, and I think where I use it most is in my more kind of philosophical works. So I have this kind of schizophrenic split in my academic person, between when I do kind of work with education development and projects, funded projects that are more kind of using design-based research and the pedagogical pattern method and stuff like that. And then the other part of me, when I do kind of educational philosophy and try to think about the future of institutions and the future of higher education, and are allowed to write more poetically and phenomenological.
Yeah, it's a bit of a luxury sometimes to be able to do that. But how did you talked about some really interesting sources there and such rich writings. Did you find that difficult to break into, or did you just find you naturally just sort of got immersed into it, no problem? Because one of the things that people say about phenomenology is that it's a little bit dense on times and hard to penetrate, even though it's really inviting as an approach and a way of thinking and all the rest of it. Actually, it's really tough to break through some of the key writers.
Well, I think it also depends on your upbringing. So being kind of stuck in analytical language philosophy, trying to prove that trees exists or there's something real in the world, and almost kind of Boolean algebra kind of logics, this was quite easy. Phenomenology.
Okay.
It was like coming home, it was like coming back to poetry and that kind of more free form way of thinking and writing. I think what makes it hard is perhaps what you are trying to use it for in a certain way. And I think that comes back to that kind of split personality. So if you use it to, when I use it to say something about the world, or about being in the world, or experiencing the world, or interacting in the world, it's a quite nice dense language for talking deeply and not superficially about those things. But if I have to kind of, I don't know, do an EU funded project on, make 10 new courses, it might be less easy to use. So I think, but the combination of the two kind of regis are nice, because you have it as a way of, that's, I think phenomenology for me is what makes my thinking come alive, gives me a vocabulary of speaking truthfully about education, and also a language that allows other people to come alive when they actually read my work. So when I do really kind of descriptive, useful articles that I also do, they're quite nice for some people, but I find that when I do my work kind of drawing on phenomenology and phenomenography, which is a special kind of phenomenology that I used, that's almost like writing a good novel, or trying to catch the world through a poem. And for me, like, where you really get your soul food from, like surviving education, surviving it as an academic, getting new thoughts, getting new ideas, suddenly realizing that you can actually write in this way and get published, or you're allowed to think about things and not necessarily deliver empirical evidence or descriptions about that kind of truth in the world. I think that's really important to have a place where you can think phenomenologically, be alive, read something just for the joy of reading it, and not for using it for something, or functionally climbing the academic ladder.
It's really joyful to listen to you speak about your journey. But at the same time, it kind of makes me feel quite jealous, because it sounds, you've obviously had some sort of kind of nourishment that's come from, whether it's your culture, the institutions that you've worked in, and those kind of immediate networks. And I think that's where I've come from, is if you're someone who kind of just listening into you is soaked on and is bought into everything you've just expressed, but hasn't had the benefit of those early structures, supports, it can be quite difficult, as Mike expressed it, to break into that. So I wondered if, is there anything, what if you were sort of advising a novice researcher who didn't have the benefit of your kind of, as you said, your background and upbringing and networks, how would you go about sort of developing your work and developing your skill set?
Yeah, so I think, well, three things at least. So the first thing is something that still follows me and have followed me since I was a teenager. That's this Danish term called jubelidiot, which is a naive idiot or something like that, optimistic idiot. So being kind of a blind optimistic idiot, and not like trying to be too strategic, but really thinking like, I can do anything, like I can write anything, it will get published somewhere, and not necessarily being too concerned about only, because it's also important of course, but only publishing in the right places, only publishing about the right things, getting the right funding and so forth. It can also come, but like just being a bit of an optimistic idiot sometimes, and allowing yourself to write, and there's actually surprisingly many venues that are interested in publishing this kind of work within education, I think. So that kind of brings me to the next point, which is about finding a home, finding a community, and it's not necessarily at your institution. So I was always, well, I'm kind of an introvert, extrovert, or whatever you would call it. So I was always alone at my institution. I didn't have that kind of support, actually, which then again, of course, ties into being an optimistic idiot, not thinking I should belong to that institution. But then finding a home elsewhere, like finding out those people that really struck you as playfellows or kindred spirits. And so recently I really found that within the philosophy and theory of higher education society, because it's like this society of educational philosophers where the more functional, digital, technological funding parts of the other side of me doesn't have a home, because that's not that society. That society is all about kind of trying to think deeply, playing with philosophy, playing with concepts, having this kind of openness towards thinking. So finding a home, and perhaps the last thing is then ties to my PhD in games and game design and phenomenological approach to games. Like, I always have this kind of approach that, okay, so if someone say to me that I can't do this, what have people said? Well, this is not actually research, would be a normal kind of get back. Like, this is not research. This is not what we're supposed to do at the university. It's all about funding and empirical evidence and stuff like that, counting things, making things that are useful for other people. Well, then it turns into a game. So, okay, so if someone says I can't do that, I will prove that I can, like, get a high publication on it. I can actually get funding from EU, even though there's like phenomenology and philosophy in there. I can do talks at so yesterday I gave a talk to the European University Association on hybrid campuses, and there was like I was a bit starstruck yesterday. There was two other people, like one of the speakers was kind of leading the student organizations in Europe, and the other one was from EU, kind of the whole new action plan for. And then I was in the middle, talking about hybrid campuses and having like crazy animal pictures and talking about philosophy and atmospheric design and genus loci, which is the spirit of a place and stuff like that. But I was invited, and they kind of knew. Well, they somewhat knew what they were getting, and it was really like a nice reception of that. I thought, okay, they will just like think is like, why is she here? What's she talking about? This crazy phenomenologically, philosophically, poetically inclined woman. But that was not the reception at all. So again, that kind of, if we don't allow ourselves to be and talk and write and think in that way, we cannot get those kind of nice surprises.
Yeah. And I have another question, because it is quite close to my heart at the moment, and that is
might have to be the last one.
You mentioned Merleau-Ponty and these other influences, but would you say that when you look back at your thesis and you were kind of explaining or documenting your methodology for the Viva, etc., how would you say that you aligned yourself quite closely to any one particular phenomenologist, and or would you say that it was more quite in the end quite individually crafted? I was just wondering just where you positioned yourself on that kind of phenomenological map.
Yeah, I think I fell deeply in love with Maxine Sheet Johnstone's work on the primacy of movement. I fell in love with it because it talked to me as a other way of thinking and writing and actually seeing the world and I really do not want to make this about gender or anything at all, but as other philosophers and other phenomenologies that were more kind of structured, and stuff like that, that there was this like flowing in the language, and there was this highlighting of being in motion and having emotions, and those kind of emotion qualities affect emotion, moods, flowing in the world was really talk naturally to me, and so I was really in love with that, because it suddenly gave me a language to speak through and speak with that I hadn't really found anywhere else. So I think for me, kind of rounding up probably, what phenomenology really gives me is a way of thinking and a way of speaking and a way of writing, and then I can always plug in works on digitalizations, work on educational development, work on student experience, works on university formats or institutional strategies that I'm also working with. But when I'm talking and when I'm writing freely, that's really the language of philosophy and phenomenology.
Thank you. That helps.
Yeah, it's incredible, and yeah, just wonderful to be able to have this conversation. I just think it's great, and a real breath of fresh air amidst all of that sort of bean counting and what I call slicing and dicing, and yeah, it gives us a bit of freedom. Yeah, and we can draw that strength from phenomenology, I think. Yeah, so good. But yeah, I think I'll probably pause recording, so it just behoves me to say thank you again, and I'll maybe do you want to sign off, Felicity, as well? But I won't actually. I'll just stop the recording.